Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Great Game, The Struggle for Empire in Central Asia by Peter Hopkirk, narrated by Alex Wyndham. Now I shall go far and far into the north, playing the great game. Rudyard Kipling, Kim, 1901. Foreword. The New Great Game. Since this book was first written, 16 years ago, momentous events have convulsed Great Game country, adding considerably to the significance of my narrative. Suddenly, after many years of almost total obscurity, Central Asia is once again in the headlines, a position it frequently occupied during the 19th century, at the height of the old Great Game between Tsarist Russia and Victorian Britain. With the sudden and dramatic collapse of communism in 1991 and the breaking up of the Soviet Empire, there sprang up almost overnight 5 entirely new countries, 8 if you include the Caucasus region. At first, even those with long experience of Central Asia had difficulty in familiarizing themselves with this new geographical and political jigsaw puzzle, not to mention getting their tongues around such Romanizations as Kyrgyzstan. It had all been so much simpler when the entire region was just called Soviet Central Asia. A single visa, if you could get one, took you from Baku to Bukhara, from Tbilisi to Tashkent, with Moscow and Leningrad thrown in. Also, though here I can only speak for myself, traveling there at the height of the Cold War was always an adventure, like sneaking behind enemy lines, particularly if one was engaged in covert research. Following Moscow's abrupt exit, Western embassies began to open up in brand new capital cities, Soviet names were expunged from the map and history books hastily rewritten, while foreign companies stepped in eagerly to fill the commercial and economic vacuum. For it was no secret that in Central Asia lay some of the last great prizes of the 20th century. These included fabulous oil and gas reserves, together with rich hoards of gold, silver, copper, zinc, lead and iron ore, not to mention crucial oil pipeline routes. So fierce was the competition that political analysts and headline writers in the West quickly began to speak of a new great game, as rival foreign powers and multinational companies fought for influence there. Some, too, had strategic and political agendas. But the sudden lurch from communism to free-for-all capitalism has not been achieved without a heavy toll. Small but vicious conflicts in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, not to mention in neighboring parts of southern Russia, such as Chechnya and North Ossetia, have since convulsed this highly volatile region as rival factions jockeyed for power. As I write this, things have gone momentarily quiet there, but not so elsewhere on the old Great Game battlefield. In Afghanistan, so long at the epicenter of the century-long Anglo-Russian confrontation, bloodshed seems almost endemic. In 1979, the Russians moved in 100,000 troops to support their puppet government. But after a barbaric 10-year conflict, they were humiliatingly forced to withdraw. They left behind them their former puppet president, General Mohammad Najibullah, who 4 years later fell into the hands of the triumphant Taliban when Kabul surrendered to them. Dragged from the UN compound where he had been given sanctuary, he was brutally beaten, castrated, then strung up publicly. Gruesome photographs of him hanging there were splashed on the front pages of the world's newspapers. It was also reported that he had been translating the Great Game into Pashto, telling friends that every Afghan should be made to read it so that the terrible mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Next to follow the Russians into Afghanistan in 2001 were US, British, Canadian, Dutch and other NATO troops. They sprang from fears that further 9/11-type attacks on Western targets might be planned from secret al-Qaeda bases there. As well as destroying these, the NATO-led force was tasked with maintaining an uneasy peace, preparing the way for elections, eliminating the drug barons, and helping with reconstruction. The UK is currently planning to dispatch more troops there to help with this nightmarish, if not impossible, task, which has so far cost the lives of 22 British servicemen, an average of 1 every 8 days. At the time of writing, the outcome of the present brutal struggle in Afghanistan is impossible to foresee. The two most powerful players in the new Great Game, the USA and Russia, are both anxious to keep Central Asia in a peaceful and cooperative state in order to preserve their access to its rich gas and oil supplies. Indeed, Russia's new power on the world stage is heavily dependent on its control of the pipelines. The thought of any new Central Asian states following the example of Iran, with its heady and alarming mix of oil, fundamentalism, and possible nuclear weapons, is viewed as hair-raising in Washington and Moscow, though happily at present this seems a remote possibility. Besides the Americans and Russians, other regional powers, notably China, India, and Pakistan, are looking on with intense self-interest and concern. For the collapse of Russian rule in Central Asia has tossed the area back into the melting pot of history. Almost anything could happen there now, and only a brave or foolish man would predict its future. For this reason, I have not attempted to update my original narrative beyond adding this brief foreword. Among all the uncertainties, however, one thing seems certain. For good or ill, Central Asia is back in the thick of the news once more, and likely to remain there for a long time to come. Peter Hopkirk. Prologue. On a June morning in 1842, in the Central Asian town of Bukhara, two ragged figures could be seen kneeling in the dust in the great square before the emir's palace. Their arms were tied tightly behind their backs, and they were in a pitiful condition. Filthy and half-starved, their bodies were covered with sores, their hair, beards, and clothes alive with lice. Not far away were two freshly dug graves. Looking on in silence was a small crowd of Bukharans. Normally executions attracted little attention in this remote and still medieval caravan town, for under the emir's vicious and despotic rule they were all too frequent. But this one was different. The two men kneeling in the blazing midday sun at the executioner's feet were British officers. For months they had been kept by the emir in a dark, stinking pit beneath the mud-built citadel, with rats and other vermin as their sole companions. The two men, Colonel Charles Stoddart and Captain Arthur Connolly, were about to face death together 4,000 miles from home, at a spot where today foreign tourists step down from their Russian buses, unaware of what once happened there. Stoddart and Connolly were paying the price of engaging in a highly dangerous game, the Great Game, as it became known to those who risked their necks playing it. Ironically, it was Connolly himself who had first coined the phrase, although it was Kipling who was to immortalize it many years later in his novel Kim. The first of the two men to die on that June morning, while his friend looked on, was Stoddart. He had been sent to Bukhara by the East India Company to try to forge an alliance with the emir against the Russians, whose advance into Central Asia was giving rise to fears about their future intentions. But things had gone badly wrong. When Connolly, who had volunteered to try to obtain his brother officer's freedom, reached Bukhara, he too had ended up in the emir's grim dungeon. Moments after Stoddart's beheading, Connolly was also dispatched, and today the two men's remains lie, together with the emir's many other victims, in a grisly and long-forgotten graveyard somewhere beneath the square. Stoddart and Connolly were merely two of the many officers and explorers, both British and Russian, who over the best part of a century took part in the Great Game, and whose adventures and misadventures while so engaged form the narrative of this book. The vast chessboard on which this shadowy struggle for political ascendancy took place stretched from the snow-capped Caucasus in the west, across the great deserts and mountain ranges of Central Asia, to Chinese Turkestan and Tibet in the east. The ultimate prize, or so it was feared in London and Calcutta, and fervently hoped by ambitious Russian officers serving in Asia, was British India. It all began in the early years of the 19th century, when Russian troops started to fight their way southwards through the Caucasus, then inhabited by fierce Muslim and Christian tribesmen, towards northern Persia. At first, like Russia's great march eastwards across Siberia 2 centuries earlier, this did not seem to pose any serious threat to British interests. Catherine the Great, it was true, had toyed with the idea of marching on India, while in 1801 her son Paul had got as far as dispatching an invasion force in that direction, only for it to be hastily recalled on his death shortly afterwards. But somehow no one took the Russians too seriously in those days, and their nearest frontier posts were too far distant to pose any real threat to the East India Company's possessions. Then, in 1807, intelligence reached London which was to cause considerable alarm to both the British government and the company's directors. Napoleon Bonaparte, emboldened by his run of brilliant victories in Europe, had put it to Paul's successor, Tsar Alexander I, that they should together invade India and wrest it from British domination. Eventually, he told Alexander. They might with their combined...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?